How do you expect your prayers to be answered? And do you ever get discouraged with God's answers if they differ from your expectations? Thank you, Brother Brian, for reading 2 Kings chapter 5 for us this morning. Today we're going to investigate so many fascinating character studies that are found in this text. The lowly servant girl, the vaulted king of Israel, the revelation of the leper Naaman, a foreigner from a distant land, the folly of the apprentice of Elisha, that being Gehazi. But before we get into this story, let's first set the historical context. The events of 2 Kings chapter 5 have taken place in a period where the northern kingdom of Israel existed in a state of fragile coexistence with its neighbor, right? Aram, or in this translation, the New King James Version, Syria. And we find we just finished 1 Kings 22, where Ahab, king of Israel, he was killed by a Syrian archer, right? So there's active conflict going on before this text. And ironically, there's active conflict going on right now between Israel and Syria. Profoundly, this war between Israel and Syria still rages. On Wednesday, Israel launched 15 airstrikes from Syria military bases just south of Damascus. And there was an article just yesterday that was published that alleges an Israeli army force of 30 vehicles entered Syria and conducted a search for multiple Syrian homes. And while moments of peace occurred, there was this tension, there was this hostility, which makes Naaman's journey, his border crossing, that much more fascinating. But I contend that we don't actually start 2 Kings chapter 5 with 2 Kings chapter 5. If you will, we're going to open up our Bibles to 2 Kings chapter 4. We read of, just yesterday, Elisha and the widow's oil, right? So we learn of Elisha's means, his ability to create finances, to make ends meet for those who are disenfranchised. We also learn of something much more fascinating, right? The raising of the Shunammite woman's son. Right? This is a woman of affluence. Kind of reminds me of an Abigail, right? Very has the means and seemingly is like the leader, the spiritual go-to in the family. And she welcomes Elisha time and time again, come stay with us. And it almost gets to the point where she convinces her husband, let's build a roof on the upper tower, on the upper building, on the roof of let's build a building, I should say, or a room on the roof of our house to accommodate Elisha and his servant. And Elisha's like, this is fantastic. I thank you so much. You've been so hospitable. What can I ever do to repay you? You want to meet with the king? Should I say a word for the king? What can I do for you? She says, I'm dwelling amongst my people. Life is good. And Elisha's servant, Gehazi, steps up. And it's worth noting that before we get into the whole idea of servant in this connotation, it's called like Elisha's servant. It's the same relationship that Elisha had with Elijah. Think of it as an apprentice or as a squire in medieval times, right? So this is kind of the successor, the mentor and mentee dynamic. Not just a servant, right? This is a young boy who's aspiring to be a spiritual leader in Israel. And he's showing promise, right? He connects the dots. He says, hey, the Shunammite woman, she's old. Her and her husband, they're older in years. They don't have a son. They have all this wealth, this house. They're able to have the means to build this room, but they don't have a son. And it's interesting because, there's certainly some echoes between Abram and Sarai, and the Shunammite woman's response is like, she's like, Elisha says, do you consider having a child? She's like, don't play with me, essentially, in a manner of words. Like, you could see how much that bears on her heart. And as we read yesterday, it does in fact a year later come to fruition, right? And there was a tragedy, there was a miracle. This boy, had some sort of issue with his head. He passed. And Gehazi was sent to heal. He was not able to. Elijah had to come and heal. But Gehazi shows this promise as being the next in line from Elijah to Elisha. And it's worth noting, too, as I practiced this last night, Kara's like, say Elisha. I'm like, I am saying Elijah. She's like, you're saying Elijah. So please, Northern Rhode Island accent. From here on out, when I say Elisha, we're saying we're predating Elijah has ascended to heaven, right? He's been taken in the previous chapter. And Elisha has requested a double portion of Elijah's spirit. Okay, so going forward, we're talking about Elisha. And forgive me if the Northern Rhode Island comes out. So that's the historical and the spiritual, the literary context in which we are now going to embark on the fully loaded chapter that is 2 Kings chapter 5. And so we begin 2 Kings chapter 5 with the introduction of Naaman. Now Naaman, commander of the army of king of Syria, was a great and honorable man in the eyes of his master, being the king, right, of Syria, a world power, because by him the Lord had given him victory to Syria. He was also a mighty man of valor, but a leper. And we know what leprosy means in the context of Hebrew, right? That physical ailment, it's that ritual uncleanness, symbolizing purity, divine judgment, isolation from the community. But it also shows that, that symbolic corruption of the flesh, that sin nature that we all are challenged with. And the irony and the contrast is, Naaman's character, it's rich with symbolic meaning. His name translates from Hebrew to pleasant, gracious, beautiful, right? So you think about that, and then ironically, here's this man contending with a hideous, heinous, painful disease. And the Syrians had gone out on raids, and they brought back a young girl from the land of Israel. She waited on Naaman's wife, right? And so she's waiting, and she sees Naaman dealing with this immense, painful condition. And she said to her mistress, "If only my master with the prophet who was in Samaria, for he would heal him from his leprosy." And I misspoke here because there's an exclamation point in the New King James. If only my master were with the prophet who is in Samaria. Think about this slave girl for a second. We're talking about that there's this warring factions, very similar to what we're seeing right now in Israel, where you have these raiding bands, right? What we saw in the atrocities that happened in Israel in October 5th, where these raiding bands come and snatch kids, snatch captives out of their homes, do heinous things to their parents, and bring them to a foreign land. This was all too common in this time. And you can imagine as a young child, it's so easy to lose faith, hopelessness. But here she is emphasizing, putting herself out there, right? She's saying, if you, Naaman, the commander of the Syrian army, you go see my prophet in Israel, he will heal you. We're talking about putting yourself out in the line. Here's a slave girl, right? And she's like, go make this trek across enemy territory. You're trying to make this peace. And you will be healed. The faith that she must have. This slave girl, in the most dire and low circumstances, go and you'll be healed. And Naaman, you can only imagine desperation, right? He tried everything else. He's so desperate, he actually goes and tells his master, the king of Syria, thus and thus says my servant girl, who I captured, who is from the land of Israel. And the king of Syria, with his level of respect that he has for Naaman, says, go, and I will send a letter to the king of Israel. And he departed and took with him 10 talents of silver, 6,000 shekels of gold, 10 changes of clothing. And then he brought the letter to the king of Israel, which said, now be advised. When this letter comes to you, I have sent Naaman my servant to you, that you may heal him of his leprosy. And it happens that when the king of Israel read this letter, he tore his clothes. Am I God to kill and make alive, that this man sends a man to heal him of leprosy? See, he's considering quarrel with me. He's trying to pick a fight. He's setting me up on something that's virtually impossible, just as an excuse to start another war with us. He tears his clothes. He has a fit in front of all of his royal guard, all of his advisors. You know, this immense show of sorrow, this immense show of fear, this immense show of lack of faith. What a contrast between this servant girl that was everything that she had was pulled from her. She was removed from her home, but God was not removed from her heart. And we compare that with this king of Israel, right? Sitting in his palace, sheer opulence by God's grace, sitting in the promised land, shaking, literally showing grief beyond measure, ripping his clothes. It's so easy for me to be like, why would he do that? But I had my own king of Israel moment. This past year, we're just about a year in, my dad has had a pretty extensive fight with leukemia. It's a TP53 mutation, which the national average for survival is 15% within 2 years. And we were elated to be at Dana-Farber, where they told us his odds are 1 in 4 of survival. We were just excited about how much the odds just jumped. And I'll never forget, we're driving and everything stops. And, I've learned that in cancer treatment, it's not just the patient's going through, it's just the logistics. It's the logistics of cancer care. It's the travel, and it's all the appointments. And I remember being at Dana-Farber when my dad received his transfusion. I was like, he's looking rough, right? Dad, how are you feeling? And he looks at me, he smiles, he goes, I feel like I've already been healed. That's the level of, he's low, and this level of faith that he has in that moment of lowness. And here I am, I have a half-written eulogy. I'm already preparing extensive summaries of how do I contextualize this man that's been so impactful to my own faith. I was ready to rent my clothes, right? I was ready to mourn. And my dad, once again, was kind of like the Elisha in this moment. We pick it up in chapter 5, verse 8. So it was when Elijah, the man of God, heard that the king of Israel torn his clothes, he sent to the king saying, why have you torn your clothes? Like, what's the big deal? Send them to me. Have faith. What are we worried about here? So you have this huge ascent of faith, right? And then you have Naaman. So he shows up at the door of Elijah's house. He has 1,000 pounds of silver, 150 pounds of gold, 10 changes of clothing. You think about traversing with that now, what that would look like in the Brinks trucks. Now you put that on camels and donkeys, and you think about the caravan that would be required to protect such wealth. He's showing up with a full-on caravan, right? And he shows up to Elijah's house. He's expecting this grandeur. He's expecting the trumpets, and he's expecting Elijah to, float down the stairs and kiss his feet and welcome him, and none of that. Elijah's messenger just walks out, says, "Yeah, this is all good. Go wash yourself in the Jordan 7 times." Naaman hasn't even met Elijah yet. And of course, Naaman's incredulous. Right? He even says it. I expected all this pomp and this circumstance. And are not the Abna and the Paphar rivers of Damascus better than all the waters? And this is the fundamental challenge that Naaman and people that are thinking of the proportionality and reciprocity in the world. They think that, hey, I show up with the loot. I show up with all the money. I expect to buy my results. I expect to buy my miracle. I expect to earn my grace. No. That's not how the God of Israel works. This is grace that transcends boundaries. This is grace that doesn't care about your financial status. This is grace that doesn't care about who you are, the position, the title that you hold. Are you willing to humble yourself and go in that Jordan River 7 times? And unfortunately, I've never been there. Maybe you can attest. Kara tells me it's not the prettiest of rivers. It's a little muddy.
Yeah, get a green hue to it.
Green hue. And he's incredulous. There's better rivers in Syria. And again, we have this servant of low esteem comes to this great general. And he speaks to him, "My father, if the prophet told you to do something great, would you not have done it?" Of course, because Naaman wanted to earn this miracle. No. How much more than if he says, "Just wash and be clean"? So he went down and Naaman dipped 7 times in the Jordan, according to the saying of the man of God. And his flesh was restored like the flesh of a little child. I could have just said that, right? But he was clean, too. He was cleaned. He was cleansed. That sin nature, that expectation that you can buy this, that his stature, that his caravan of goods and wealth could earn him this miracle, has been cleansed from his head. And now, instead of trying to buy it, he comes before Elisha, because now he returned to the man of God, and he stood before Elijah. Now Elijah's like, "You've been cleansed, I'm willing to meet you now. Now you know what we're about." And Naaman says, "I know that there is no God in all the earth except in Israel. Now, please take a gift from your servant." This is no longer, I'm not trying to buy this. This is no longer an exchange. This is a gift as a sign of my appreciation. But Elisha reminds him, "As the Lord lives, before whom I stand, I will receive nothing." And again, Naaman urges him to take it, but he refuses. Elijah's like, "No, this is not, there's going to be no exchange here. This is unbridled, free grace. You show up in humility, it's yours." So Naaman says, "If not, please let your servant be giving," this is beautiful, 2 mule loads of earth. "For your servant will no longer offer either burnt offerings or sacrifice to other gods, but to the Lord." There's so much understanding that Naaman conveys here. He said, "I showed up with these thousands of pounds of silver, and all I want to take now is this land of Israel." Symbolizing, number one, that there is no, when he goes back to this God he talks about, Rimmon, there is no image or idol to worship. That this soil, this ground from Israel, is of more importance than any image, any gold that he has going in, that this mule load of the land in which the one true God resides is more important than all the gold and silver that he came with. And he asked for forgiveness. Like, when I bow and I'm holding the hand of the king, and we have to go through the ceremony of worshiping this other God, I know that this is just a farce. I know that this is a ceremony and that there is only one true God. And Elijah says, "Go your own way. Go in peace." So he departs from a short distance, right? So you have this huge revelation of Naaman. He's brought low. He realizes that more important than all the gold and silver is this dirt. And he's walking away with this dirt. And Gehazi, the understudy, who had this brilliant idea to give this woman a son, in the chapter before, he sees all the sparkling gold disappear. Gehazi stands to reason. He saw the vats of oil that were miraculously filled the chapter before. He saw that Elisha has the means to make ends meet. But Gehazi sees the riches of the world after all of this is displayed in front of him. And he has that own origin of leprosy, that sin nature, that, wait a second, this foreigner's offered us all the money I couldn't even fathom. I'm going to go get a little piece of this. And it's so interesting because when he catches up to Naaman, he asks for, he makes it, immediately starts to lie. There's two sons of the prophets who have come, these young men. Let's make sure that they're taken care of. So there's these two, be mindful of this, right? Two sons of the prophets. Naaman says, please take 2 talents and bound those 2 talents of silver in 2 bags with 2 changes of garments and handed them to 2 of his servants, and they carried on ahead of him. All right, what's the 2 about? Well, we think about the echo and the contrast of when Elijah was about to ascend. What did Elisha ask for? A double serving of spirit. Elijah had this mindset of, hey, I just want the means to spread God's will in the land of Israel. And here's his understudy saying, hey, I just want 2 of everything you got. Give me 2. If it's free, I'll take 2 of each. What a contrast. Naaman's happy to give it. He doesn't care about this wealth anymore. He's found what really matters. And Gehazi goes back and Elijah, confronts him. My spirit went out with you. You can only imagine Elisha's burden. This is the guy who asked that double portion of spirit, and that double portion of spirit is now showing him his understudy's betrayal. A complete 180 deviation from the way that they were supposed to be going. And it almost feels like after all of this great miracle that occurs in this chapter, that it ends on a really terrible note, right? This promising young understudy of Gehazi now has the leprosy of Naaman, and it's clinging to him and his descendants forever. You want to talk about a heavy burden, right? And he went out from his presence leprous, white as snow. So even more leprous than when Naaman showed up. And now Gehazi has this leprosy. And you're just deflated, right? You've seen that we just experienced such a roller coaster of character arcs and God's grace, and now what? Well, we stop and think before we get to the floating axe head in the next chapter. What happened to that servant girl? After all the travesty, all the horror she's witnessed in her life, you imagine what Naaman did to her when he came back? I wouldn't be surprised if he took her in as his own daughter. He has all this abundance of wealth that he expected to barter his grace. He realized that he truly received grace. He is eye-opened, right? He brings back the dirt. Was the dirt for the slave girl? Who knows? But I'm willing to develop some conjecture here that she lived a pretty good life after that. And that God can work miraculous things out of the most dire of circumstances. And I also felt compelled to keep reading 2 Kings. And you're welcome to turn with me or just take it all in. 2 Kings chapter 8. Sometimes you have to have patience to answer prayer. 2 Kings chapter 8, we have something really profound. Starting in verse 1, Elijah spoke to the woman whose son had restored. And he said, hey, go. There's going to be 7 years, essentially, and I'll summarize here. There's going to be 7 years of famine. Get out of this land, right? So she leaves her land to avoid the 7 years of famine. She comes back. After 7 years. And she goes to the king to plead with her land back, right? She abandoned her land, massive famine. Who knows what type of scoundrels are inhabiting it now. And she's going to the king to plead for it back. And this is you want to talk about a redemption story. We'll pick it up in verse 3. And it came to pass at the end of 7 years, a woman returned from the land of Philistines, and she went to make an appeal for the king, for her house and for her land. Then the king talked with Gehazi, the servant of God. So she's walking in, and the king 7 years later is conferring with Gehazi, the servant of the man of God. Gehazi, the servant of Elijah. Gehazi, despite leaving 7 years ago from that endeavor, leprous as snow, we find him back, still serving Elijah. And the king saying, "Tell me, please, all the great things Elijah has done." Now it happened that, as he's telling the king how he had restored the dead to life, that there was this woman whose son he had restored to life, appealing to the king for her house and for her land. And Gehazi said, "My lord, O king, this is the woman, and this is her son, whom Elijah restored to life." How beautiful is that? You see, Gehazi, despite this leprous nature now that he for 7 years, he now sees coming through the door of the king, right? He's still conferring and he's recounting all the great things that Elisha has done. He's not holding Elisha accountable for this generational leprous curse. He realizes that was his own merit. He still has his zeal. He's still recounting the great things that Elisha has done. And God gives this beautiful reminder of the good that Gehazi has brought into the world. Because 7 years later, from the chapter we read today, so you can only imagine that the Shunammite woman's son is probably teenage years now. He's seeing a teenager example. This teenager was created by the ideation of Gehazi's heart, saying, "Hey, this is a good idea. She doesn't have a child." Well, guess what? Now she almost has a young man that's coming through the doors. She's asking for her land. And Gehazi is reminded that remarkable things can happen, even when we fall short, even when we get distracted by the riches of the world, even though we are succumbed to leprosy, that sin, that flesh nature that's white as snow. And Gehazi said, "My lord, O king, this is the woman, this is her son." Elijah restored her to life, and whom Elisha restored to life. And when the king asked the woman, she told him. So the king appointed a certain officer for saying, "Restore all that was hers, and in the proceeds of the field from the day that she left into the land until now." So everything's restored to this woman, and you just get the sense that Gehazi realizes that grace has been restored to him. Wow. And that's the beauty of the scripture. I mean, the gospel is just ever present in this chapter. And we know that the Jordan River holds immense significance, of course, as we turn our attention to the table. We think about the one who was baptized in the Jordan, willingly. And we can see ourselves, at least I can, in the King of Israel, falling short of faith and somehow being restored and being willing to restore to the Shunammite woman, showing some of that justness later on after a lapse of faith. We think of Gehazi and that lapse of priority, realizing that he should never have been pursuing the riches that was departing from the mules. He should be valuing that dirt that Naaman also valued, that symbolizes the presence of God, the one true God in Israel. Remember Naaman, who came in there with all the grandeur and realized that wealth means nothing, that we are just sojourners, and that grace comes through humility, being brought low, so that we can spread grace to others. And above all else, let's think of that slave girl. Let's think that even in some of our most dire circumstances, heinous atrocities, that God can create great grace and salvation to a foreigner from a distant land, to an enemy of Israel. And let us think about our own challenges, our own burdens, and realize that these burdens very well could be an opportunity for God to spread his grace. And finally, as we look to this table, let us consider our own flesh nature. As we ourselves are engulfed in leprosy, as white as snow, we all fall short. And we all, by God's grace, have the opportunity to partake of this cup, to be cleansed. As a young baby, and as we consider all this, I read to you Luke 17, starting in verse 11, from the New King James. Now it happened as he went to Jerusalem that he passed through the midst of Samaria and Galilee. Then as he entered a certain village, there met him 10 men who were lepers. They stood afar off, and they lifted up their voices and said, Jesus, Master, have mercy on us. So when he saw them, he said to them, Go and show yourselves to the priest. And so it was that as they went, they were cleansed. And one of them, when he saw that he was healed, returned, and with a loud voice glorified God. He fell down at his face. He fell his face down and his feet, giving thanks to him. And he was a Samaritan, an outsider, just like us. So Jesus answered and said, Were there not 10 cleansed? But where are the 9? Were there not any found who returned to give glory to God except this foreigner? And Jesus said to him, Arise, go your way. Your faith has made you well.